The first boot caught her in the ribs with surgical precision. Lieutenant Junior Grade Sarah Chen tasted copper and dirt, her face pressed into California sand, while 3 sets of hands pinned her arms, her legs, her future. Senior Chief Brennan circled like a shark, his voice carrying across the abandoned training facility with words that sounded like justice, but felt like rage. "Who's going to save you now?" 12 sailors formed a ring around her broken body, and not one of them knew the truth. The German shepherd charging across that compound had been raised by her hands since he was 8 weeks old. The scars hidden beneath her torn uniform marked her as something they couldn't comprehend. When that 90-pound missile of fur and teeth hit the first attacker, everything they believed about women in warfare would detonate like a breaching charge. Before we dive into Sarah's story, if you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. Let's see how far this story travels. And if stories about courage, loyalty, and the warriors who refuse to quit matter to you, hit that subscribe button. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a truth that needs telling. The pain in Sarah Chen's ribs wasn't new. She'd been cataloging damage for 3 weeks now, each injury adding to a map of hostility that her body had become. But lying face down in the sand with Brennan's boot pressing between her shoulder blades, she understood that everything before this moment had been prologue. This was the chapter where they tried to break her completely. "Get up," Brennan said, his voice flat and professional, like he was conducting a routine training evolution instead of an assault. "You wanted to be here. Prove you belong." Sarah pushed against the sand, her arms shaking, not from weakness, but from the restraint it took not to execute the 17 different ways she knew to neutralize him. Her body remembered techniques he'd never heard of, training that didn't exist in any manual he'd ever read. She got to her knees, tasted blood from where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek, and looked up at the ring of sailors watching her with expressions that ranged from discomfort to barely concealed satisfaction. "This isn't training," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the screaming in her ribs. "This is assault." Petty Officer Jackson laughed, the sound harsh and ugly in the morning air. "Assault? We're testing standards. You said you could handle everything we could. So handle it." 3 weeks earlier, Sarah had arrived at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, carrying a service record that looked unremarkable, and a truth she couldn't speak. The Pacific Ocean had stretched endlessly blue beyond the compound gates, and she'd stood there for a full minute before entering, knowing that everything after would be a different kind of warfare than what she'd already survived. The guard at the gate had checked her orders twice, his expression suggesting he'd found a mistake that hadn't been caught by whoever processed her transfer. "LTJG Chen? You're assigned to the Integration Pilot Program?" "That's correct." "First female officer in the program." It wasn't a question, and his tone suggested it was a problem he was glad wouldn't be his to solve. Sarah had smiled with practiced politeness, the kind that concealed everything real. "I'm aware." The Naval Special Warfare Center sprawled across prime California real estate with the kind of deliberate organization that spoke of hierarchy and tradition and knowing your place. Buildings arranged in precise geometry, training facilities that had produced legends, memorial walls bearing names of men who died in places that remained classified decades later. Sarah's father's name should have been on one of those walls, would have been, if the circumstances of his death in Yemen hadn't required the official story to list him elsewhere. Master Chief Daniel Chen had been SEAL royalty, 3 silver stars, and a legend that outlived him. He'd taught Sarah that reputation was smoke, that the only currency that mattered was what you could do when everything was falling apart and nobody was watching. He'd died when she was 16, and she'd made a promise at his funeral that had led her here, to this moment, to this test she'd designed for herself. The BOQ room they'd assigned her was standard Navy issue, a space designed for temporary occupancy by people who weren't expected to stay long. She'd unpacked efficiently, placing the single photo she'd brought on the small desk. The image showed her father in dress whites at her high school graduation, his hand on her shoulder, his expression carrying pride that had nothing to do with grades or achievements, and everything to do with the person she was becoming. Standards don't care about gender, he told her that day. Results do. Remember that when it gets hard, because it will get hard. Sarah had reported to the command building at 0700 the next morning, her uniform pressed to knife edges, her mind prepared for resistance, but hoping for professionalism. Captain Rodriguez had been waiting in his office, a career SEAL officer whose face carried the kind of weathering that came from decades of hard decisions in harder places. Lieutenant Junior Grade Chen, he gestured to a chair without standing, a subtle test of protocol that she'd passed by waiting for explicit permission before sitting. Your orders indicate you're part of the Integration Pilot Program. Support roles with direct access to NSW operations. Yes, sir. Your record shows 4 years in intelligence at Naval Special Warfare Development Group, coordinator for Canine Assets, 2 deployments to Afghanistan, classified operations in Syria. Rodriguez had paused, his eyes sharp and assessing. That's the official record. Want to tell me what's not in the official record? Sarah had maintained eye contact, her expression neutral. I'm not sure what you mean, sir. I've been doing this for 26 years, Lieutenant. I know what a scrubbed service jacket looks like. I know what it means when someone's real credentials are classified above my pay grade. He'd leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. I don't need to know the details, but I need to know if you're here because you want to prove something, or because you're running from something. The question had landed like a punch, precise and unavoidable. Sarah had taken a breath, choosing words carefully. My father taught me that service means going where you're needed, not where you're comfortable. Women are integrating into NSW support roles. I have relevant experience. I want to be part of making that integration successful. Noble sentiment. Rodriguez hadn't smiled. The reality is going to be uglier than you're imagining. Even with the best intentions, this command has cultural antibodies that react badly to change. You're going to face resistance. Some of it professional, a lot of it personal. Some of these men lost brothers in combat. They see integration as disrespect to that sacrifice. With respect, sir, that's not logic. That's bias looking for justification. I agree completely. Doesn't make it less real. Rodriguez had pulled out a folder, slid it across the desk. This is your assignment. You'll be working with training programs, coordinating support assets, and yes, proving that women can operate effectively in this environment. I'm required to inform you that if at any point the situation becomes untenable, you can request transfer without prejudice. Sarah had taken the folder without opening it. I won't be requesting transfer, sir. We'll see. Rodriguez had stood then, offering his hand. Welcome to Coronado, Lieutenant. I hope you prove me wrong about how hard this is going to be. She'd met Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Brennan 20 minutes later, and within 30 seconds understood that Rodriguez had actually understated how hard this would be. Brennan was 34, a 12-year SEAL veteran with combat deployments across 3 theaters, and a reputation as the backbone of his team. He'd been standing outside the training building when Sarah had approached, his posture carrying the kind of casual authority that came from men who'd proven themselves in ways that left no room for doubt. You're Chen. Not a question. LTJG Chen, yes. Brennan had looked her up and down with an expression that wasn't quite hostile, but definitely wasn't welcoming. I'm Senior Chief Brennan. You'll be coordinating with my training section for the integration program. He'd said integration program like it was a disease. Let me be clear about something up front. I don't have a problem with women serving. I have a problem with standards being compromised to meet political quotas. You show me you can perform without special treatment, we won't have issues. You expect us to lower the bar because of your gender? We're going to have problems. Sarah had kept her voice level, professional. I don't expect special treatment, Senior Chief. I expect to be evaluated on my performance, same as anyone else. Good. Brennan had turned to walk away, then paused. One more thing. Lieutenant Reeves died 8 months ago in a training accident. This team is still processing that. You're walking into a group of men who are grieving and angry. They're going to take that out on you whether you deserve it or not. That's not fair, but it's real. Just so you know what you're dealing with. The name Reeves had hit Sarah like ice water. She'd known about the death, had read the official report during her transfer preparation. Training accident, equipment failure, tragic but no fault assigned. But the way Brennan said it suggested a different narrative circulated among the men who'd been there. A story that assigned blame in ways the official investigation hadn't. I appreciate the context, Senior Chief. Brennan had studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression that Sarah couldn't read. You know what? I don't think you do. But you will. The first week had been professionally hostile, the kind of cold reception that stayed just inside the boundaries of acceptable behavior, while making absolutely clear she wasn't wanted. During briefings, other officers and enlisted men would arrange seating, so Sarah ended up isolated. During training observations, her questions were answered with minimal information. During meals, the table she chose would empty within minutes. Sarah had absorbed it all without reaction, had learned years ago in places she couldn't discuss that some battles couldn't be won by fighting, only by refusing to quit. She'd focused on her work, coordinating training schedules and support assets with meticulous attention to detail, proving through action that she belonged in this space, even if the men around her didn't agree. The breaking point with Petty Officer Jackson had come during a routine equipment inspection on day 5. Sarah had been checking manifests for a K-9 training evolution when Jackson had deliberately knocked her tablet off the desk. Oops, he'd said, his tone making clear it wasn't an accident. Sarah had picked up the tablet, checked for damage, and continued working without comment. Jackson had stood there, waiting for a reaction, and when he didn't get one, had escalated. You know what I think? I think you're here because some admiral somewhere decided it would look good for his promotion to have women in NSW. I think you have no idea what you're doing. I think you're going to get someone killed, and we're all going to have to live with that because nobody had the balls to say no to diversity metrics. The words had landed in the quiet office like grenades, and Sarah had felt every eye turn toward her, waiting to see how she'd respond. She'd set down her tablet carefully, stood, and looked at Jackson with the same expression she'd used on insurgents who thought they could intimidate her in places where rank didn't matter, only capability. Petty Officer Jackson, you're entitled to your opinions about integration policy. You're not entitled to disrespect a superior officer based on those opinions. If you have concerns about my competence, you can submit them through proper channels. If you interfere with my equipment again, I'll write you up for conduct unbecoming. Are we clear? Jackson had stared at her, clearly not expecting that response, and Sarah had seen the moment when he'd decided to push harder. You think you can write me up? You think anyone here is going to back you over me? We take care of our own, Lieutenant, and you're not our own. The threat had hung in the air, explicit and ugly, and Sarah had made a decision in that moment that would define everything that followed. She could report this, could involve the chain of command, could use the protective mechanisms that existed precisely for situations like this. Or she could handle it herself. could prove that she didn't need special protection, could demonstrate that women could navigate hostile environments without running to authority figures for salvation. She'd chosen to handle it herself. That choice had led here, to this moment, to Brennan's boot between her shoulder blades and Jackson's laughter echoing across the abandoned training facility. "Get up," Brennan said again, his patience wearing thin. "We're not done testing your standards." Sarah pushed to her feet, her body protesting but complying. She looked at the ring of 12 sailors and understood that this was the culmination of 3 weeks of escalating hostility. The moment when their discomfort with her presence had metastasized into something that would end careers. Hers or theirs, depending on what happened in the next hour. "What exactly are we testing, Senior Chief?" she asked, her voice carrying across the sand with a clarity that surprised her given the pain radiating from her ribs. "Whether you can actually perform under pressure without the safety nets that let you get here." Brennan gestured to the obstacle course that sprawled behind him, a collection of walls and ropes and obstacles designed to break bodies and spirits. "You're going to run the course, full combat load. We're going to provide appropriate resistance to simulate real-world conditions. You complete it in under the standard time, we accept that maybe you deserve to be here. You fail, you request transfer, and stop wasting everyone's time." "And if I refuse to participate in an unsanctioned evolution?" "Then everyone here knows you're exactly what we thought. Someone who talks about standards but hides behind regulations when it's time to prove it." Sarah looked at each face in the circle, reading the mixture of anticipation and discomfort and barely concealed hostility. These weren't bad men, not fundamentally. They were scared men, angry men, grieving men who'd been given a target for all those complicated emotions and had convinced themselves that hostility was the same as honor. "I'll run your course," she said quietly. "Under one condition. When I complete it, you acknowledge in front of everyone here that I earned my place. No qualifications, no excuses." Brennan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "When you complete it." That's confidence. "All right, Lieutenant. You finish in under 17 minutes with full combat load. We'll acknowledge you earned your place." He didn't say what would happen if she didn't finish, but Sarah heard it in the silence that followed. The combat load they strapped onto her was heavier than standard issue, weighted to test rather than train. 45 pounds of vest and gear and ammunition that wasn't ammunition, just weight designed to make everything harder. Her ribs screamed as they tightened the straps, and she forced her face to remain neutral, giving them nothing to feed on. The course started with a wall climb, 12 feet of vertical barrier that required upper body strength and technique. Sarah hit it at a run, found handholds that weren't immediately obvious, and pulled herself up with movements that were economical and practiced. At the top, she paused for just a second, long enough to see Brennan's expression shift from confident to uncertain. And then she was over and dropping to the sand on the other side. The rope traverse came next, 60 feet of hemp stretched between 2 platforms, arms burning and hands already raw from the wall. She could hear Jackson behind her, close enough to be intimidating, but not quite interfering. Yet, Sarah focused on breathing, on rhythm, on the techniques she'd learned in a training program these men didn't know existed. Halfway across the rope, Jackson grabbed her ankle. The movement was quick, disguised as an accident, but the intention was clear. Sarah didn't hesitate, didn't give him time to establish his grip. She executed a move that wasn't in any NSW training manual, a twist and counter leverage that broke his hold and nearly sent him off the rope. For just a second, she saw surprise flash across his face, the recognition that she'd responded with a technique he didn't recognize and couldn't counter. "Stay back," she said, her voice low and hard. "Where the next time, I won't be gentle." She reached the far platform ahead of schedule, her arms screaming but functional. The next obstacle was a tunnel crawl, 50 feet of enclosed space barely 2 feet high, designed to trigger claustrophobia and test willingness to endure discomfort. Sarah dropped to her stomach and entered without hesitation, the combat load making every movement harder, every breath more labored. Inside the tunnel, someone had added something that wasn't part of the standard course. Rocks, deliberately placed to make the crawl more painful, to create pressure points that would bruise and hurt and make continuing nearly impossible. Sarah felt them dig into her knees, her elbows, her ribs that were already compromised, and understood that this wasn't testing anymore. This was punishment disguised as evaluation. She kept moving, refused to stop. Her father's voice echoed in her head with words he'd spoken years ago, advice that had seemed abstract then, but felt urgently real now. Pain is just information. It tells you something's damaged, but it doesn't get to decide whether you quit. That's your choice. Always your choice. Sarah emerged from the tunnel ahead of schedule, blood seeping through her uniform from where the rocks had torn skin. Her breathing labored but controlled. Brennan was waiting at the next station, his expression no longer confident, now something closer to concern. "You can stop," he said, and for the first time his voice carried something other than hostility. "Medical is standing by. Nobody will think less of you for calling it." Sarah looked at him with eyes that had seen things he'd never be cleared to know about, operations that wouldn't be declassified for decades. Moments when stopping meant dying, and dying meant failing the people who depended on her. "I'll finish the course, Senior Chief." The final obstacle was a rope climb, 30 feet straight up to a platform, then a controlled descent on the far side. Sarah's hands were bleeding now, torn from the rope traverse and the tunnel crawl, every grip sending fire through nerve endings that wanted her to stop. She looked up at the rope, calculated what it would cost to climb, and made the decision that separated operators from everyone else. She climbed. Hand over hand, legs wrapping and pushing, body weight and determination overcoming damage and pain. At the platform, she didn't pause to celebrate, just transitioned to the descent with practiced efficiency and hit the ground with 17 seconds to spare. Sarah stood there, swaying slightly, her body cataloging damage that would require medical attention she wouldn't seek, because seeking it meant admitting weakness. She turned to face Brennan and the other 11 sailors, her expression neutral, waiting for the acknowledgement she'd been promised. Brennan's face had gone through several expressions in the time it took Sarah to complete the course, landing finally on something that looked like reluctant respect, mixed with continued resentment. "You finished. Under time, full combat load. That's impressive." "We had an agreement, Senior Chief. I complete the course. You acknowledge I earned my place, in front of everyone." The silence stretched. Sarah could see the calculations happening behind Brennan's eyes, the war between his commitment to the agreement and his unwillingness to accept what her success meant for his narrative. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You earned your place," he said, the words quiet but clear. "Based on this performance, you demonstrated capability consistent with NSW standards." It should have been victory. Should have been the moment when everything shifted, when proof overcame prejudice. Instead, Jackson stepped forward, his face flushed with anger that had been building for 3 weeks. "This is bullshit," he spat. "You want us to believe you're qualified because you survived one course? We survive courses every day. You want to really prove yourself? Let's do combatives. Real pressure testing, not just obstacle." Sarah felt her body tense, recognized the trap being set. Combatives training was legitimate, part of standard NSW curriculum. But the way Jackson said it, the way several other sailors nodded in agreement, made clear that what he was proposing wasn't training at all. It was an opportunity to hurt her in ways that could be explained as training accidents. "I completed your test," Sarah said carefully. "We had an agreement." "The agreement was you'd prove yourself," Brennan interjected, and Sarah heard the shift in his tone, the way he was letting Jackson's escalation give him permission to extend the testing beyond what they'd originally agreed. "Jackson's right. Obstacle courses are one metric. Combatives training is another. You want us to fully accept you're qualified? Show us you can handle contact." Every instinct Sarah had developed through years of actual combat operations screamed that this was the moment to walk away, to recognize that proving yourself to people who'd already decided to hate you was impossible. But another voice, older and more insistent, her father's voice, reminded her that sometimes the only way through was through. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's test combative standards." The fighting started professionally enough, basic grappling drills that were standard across military training programs. Sarah partnered with Petty Officer Martinez, a wiry sailor with wrestling experience who executed techniques with competent precision. They went through hip throws and arm bars and escape sequences, and Sarah matched him movement from movement, her body remembering training that went far beyond what most people experienced. Then Brennan called for partner rotations, and Sarah found herself facing Jackson. His smile was ugly, anticipatory, the expression of someone who'd been waiting for permission to do damage. They started with a basic takedown drill, Jackson as attacker, Sarah defending. The first attempt was legitimate, textbook execution that Sarah countered cleanly. The second was harder, Jackson using his weight advantage to force the technique. The third crossed the line. He drove his shoulder into her ribs, the same ones already damaged from the obstacle course, with force that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with hurting. Sarah felt something crack, sharp pain that stole her breath, and Jackson's grin widened. "You all right, Lieutenant? Looking a little pale." Sarah reset her stance, forced her breathing to stabilize, and prepared for the next exchange. She could stop this, could call medical, could report the obvious escalation. But stopping now meant everything Jackson had said about women needing special protection would be true. Meant every man who'd ever doubted whether women belonged in combat roles would have their prejudices confirmed. "Again," she said, her voice steady despite the screaming in her ribs. They went again. And again. Each exchange pushing harder, each technique executed with more force. Other sailors formed a circle, some watching with discomfort, others with barely concealed satisfaction. Brennan observed from the edge, his expression unreadable, letting it continue past the point where any responsible instructor would have intervened. Martinez finally stepped forward. "Senior Chief, maybe we should let the lieutenant prove she can handle the same training we all went through." Brennan cut him off. "She wants to be here. This is what being here looks like." The beating that followed would later be described in official reports as combatives training that escalated beyond appropriate parameters. That clinical language would fail to capture the reality of what happened when professional skepticism metastasized into sanctioned violence. Jackson took Sarah down with a sweep that wasn't in any training manual, put her face first in the sand, and before she could recover, two other sailors pinned her arms while Jackson delivered calculated strikes to her ribs, her kidneys, her vulnerable places, where damage could be explained as training accidents. Sarah tried to defend herself, tried to execute techniques that would stop the assault, but there were too many of them, and her body was already compromised. She felt consciousness starting to slip, her vision tunneling, her body's defense mechanisms trying to shut down to protect her from further damage. Brennan's voice cut through the chaos, asking the question that would later define him. Who's going to save you now? And that's when the world exploded, with fur and teeth and rage. The German Shepherd hit Jackson like a freight train loaded with divine retribution. 90 pounds of muscle and focused aggression knocked him sideways into the sand, jaws locking onto his forearm with bite pressure that exceeded 700 psi. Jackson's scream cut through the California morning, high and panicked, the sound of a man who'd suddenly discovered he wasn't the predator in this equation. The circle shattered. Sailors scrambled backward, their combat training momentarily forgotten in the face of an attacking dog that had appeared from nowhere with targeting precision that suggested intelligence, not instinct. The shepherd released Jackson's arm, blood already soaking through torn fabric, and turned on Brennan with ears flat against his skull and teeth bared in a display that promised violence. "Jesus Christ," Martinez breathed, his hand reaching for a training weapon that wouldn't help against an animal that moved like liquid death. "Where did that thing come from?" Brennan backed up 3 steps, his brain trying to process what his eyes were seeing. Military working dogs didn't attack without handler commands. They didn't break from canine facilities and cross 2 miles of base to engage targets they'd never been cleared for. They didn't move with the kind of tactical precision this shepherd was demonstrating, positioning himself between Sarah's broken body and the men who'd hurt her. The dog's brown eyes locked onto Brennan with an intensity that transcended animal behavior and entered something closer to conscious judgment. His stance was textbook protection work, weight forward, muscles coiled for explosive movement, every line of his body communicating a single message: approach her again, and someone dies. Sarah pushed herself up on her elbows, tasted blood and sand, and felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with broken ribs. Through the pain and the tunnel vision and the rage that wanted to consume her, recognition bloomed like a sunrise. She knew this dog, knew the specific pattern of his markings, the exact angle of his ears, the way he held his tail when operating in protection mode. Knew him because she'd raised him from 8 weeks old, had deployed with him to 4 different theaters, had trusted him with her life more times than she could count. "Odin," she whispered, the name catching in her throat. The shepherd's ears swiveled toward her voice, his massive head turning fractionally, attention divided between the threats surrounding him and the handler he'd thought was lost forever. His tail gave one uncertain wag, muscle memory fighting against tactical conditioning, the eternal war between working dog discipline and pack loyalty. Jackson was still screaming, cradling his arm while blood dripped onto pristine sand. "That thing tried to kill me! Someone shoot it!" "Nobody's shooting anything," Sarah said, her voice stronger now despite the damage her body had absorbed. She pushed to a sitting position, felt her vision swim, forced it to stabilize through sheer will. "Stand down, all of you. This is my dog." Brennan stared at her like she'd started speaking Mandarin. "Your dog? You don't have a dog. You're an intelligence officer. You coordinate canine assets. You don't—" Sarah whistled. The sound cut through his words with the precision of a scalpel. 3 short bursts followed by a pause, then 2 longer tones that descended in pitch. The pattern was specific, trained, part of a command structure that existed outside normal military canine protocols. Odin's entire posture shifted from attack readiness to focused attention, his eyes finding Sarah's face with recognition that transcended time and separation. She whistled again, 4 short tones, descending. "Stand down. Return to handler." Odin complied immediately, trotting to her position with movements that were controlled but urgent, positioning himself at her side while keeping his eyes locked on the sailors who'd scattered. His tail still wasn't wagging. This was a working dog in mission mode, protecting his handler from confirmed threats. "That's not possible," Martinez said quietly, his voice carrying confusion more than hostility. MWDs don't respond to random whistles. They only obey their assigned handlers using approved command structures. Unless you're saying... He trailed off, the implication hanging in the air like smoke. Sarah reached up with her right hand, her movements slow and deliberate, and rested it on Odin's head. The shepherd leaned into the contact, his breathing steadying, his aggression ebbing fractionally while never fully disappearing. She felt scars under her fingers from shrapnel wounds he'd taken in Syria, felt the muscle memory in his neck from carrying tactical vests through combat operations, felt the truth pressing against the cover story she'd maintained for 3 weeks. "I trained him," she said simply. "Raised him from a puppy. Deployed with him 6 times across 4 theaters. He's been retired for 4 months due to hip dysplasia. Last I heard, he was placed here at Coronado for his retirement years, working with the Canine Training Program." The silence that followed was absolute. 12 sailors stood frozen, their brains trying to reconcile what she was saying with what they'd believed about her. Intelligence officers didn't raise war dogs. Support personnel didn't deploy to classified operations. Women who needed protection didn't have German shepherds that attacked with tactical precision to defend them. Brennan found his voice first, but it came out wrong, uncertain in ways that didn't fit with the confident authority he'd projected for 3 weeks. "You're saying you're a canine handler? That's not in your service record. You're listed as an intelligence analyst at NSWDG, coordination role, no operational deployment." "The service record you're looking at is the unclassified version," Sarah interrupted, her voice flat with exhaustion and pain, and the relief of finally speaking truth. "The actual record is sealed above your clearance level, above Captain Rodriguez's level, above almost everyone's level at this command." Jackson had stopped screaming, was now staring at her with his damaged arm clutched against his chest, his face cycling through shock and disbelief and dawning horror. "You're lying. You're making this up to cover for the fact that Dog attacked..." Odin growled, low and menacing, a clear warning that Jackson's continued talking was testing his patience. Sarah rested more weight against the shepherd, felt him adjust his stance to support her, felt the bond that combat forged and retirement couldn't erase. "I'm not lying," she said quietly. "And you're about to find out exactly how badly you miscalculated." The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the tension, multiple engines moving fast toward their position. Sarah recognized Captain Rodriguez's command vehicle in the lead, followed by a civilian SUV that didn't belong to anyone on base. The convoy pulled up 50 yards away, and 5 people emerged with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested this wasn't a routine inspection. Rodriguez led the group, his face carrying cold fury that made experienced sailors take unconscious steps backward. Behind him came Lieutenant Commander Grace Wells from JAG, a legal officer whose presence meant official consequences were already in motion. Behind her came 2 shore patrol officers with sidearms and expressions that suggested they were prepared for resistance. And behind them, moving with the calm authority of someone who'd commanded men in places where rank mattered less than capability, came a face Sarah hadn't seen in 4 months. Vice Admiral James Mitchell, retired, formerly the commanding officer of a joint special operations task force that ran programs too sensitive for official acknowledgement. He was 58 now, gray hair and weathered features that came from decades of hard decisions, and his eyes found Sarah's face with recognition and something that looked like vindication. "Senior Chief Brennan," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying across the sand with razor precision. "Would you care to explain why I just received a report that a military working dog escaped from the canine facility and crossed 2 miles of this base to attack personnel in your training section?" Brennan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words emerged. Sarah watched him struggle with the impossible task of explaining the unexplainable, of justifying what had started as sanctioned skepticism and metastasized into assault. Mitchell stepped forward before Brennan could formulate an answer. He pulled out his phone with deliberate slowness, pulled up a photo, and held it out for everyone to see. The image showed Sarah in full combat kit, plate carrier loaded with live magazines, helmet cam mounted, suppressed rifle held with the casual competence of someone who'd carried weapons in anger. She stood on an airfield somewhere in Afghanistan, the image quality suggesting official combat photographer documentation. Odin sat at her side, younger and in his prime, wearing a tactical vest that identified him as a working dog on deployment. The woman in the photo was unmistakably Sarah, maybe 4 years younger, but clearly the same person. "Lieutenant Junior Grade Sarah Chen," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made junior enlisted stand straighter without understanding why. "Formerly assigned to a joint Special Operations K-9 integration program that officially doesn't exist. Spent 4 years training and deploying with Naval Special Warfare Development Group as a handler-operator. Modified BUD/S graduate, one of the first 3 women to complete the program, though her name never appeared in press releases because her training was classified." He swiped to another photo. This one showed a graduation ceremony. 8 handlers standing with their dogs in front of a nondescript building, faces visible but blurred for security. Sarah stood third from the left, her hand resting on a younger Odin's head, her expression carrying pride and exhaustion in equal measure. "She deployed 6 times between 2020 and 2024, Mitchell continued, his words falling like hammer blows on Brennan's career. "Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and 2 locations that remain classified. She earned a Navy Cross for actions in Syria that won't be declassified for another 15 years. Actions that involved extracting a wounded handler team from a kill zone while under sustained enemy fire. She carried 2 wounded men and 1 wounded dog 300 meters through active combat, held security until exfil arrived, and didn't take a scratch herself." Martinez made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, the noise of a man watching his worldview collapse in real time. "Navy Cross? You're saying she's earned the 2nd highest?" "I'm saying she's earned credentials that make everyone in this circle look like basic training washouts," Mitchell said, his voice cutting through the protest before it could fully form. "The dog standing over her, Odin, was raised by her hands from 8 weeks old. He deployed with her to 4 theaters, saved 9 lives through explosive detection, 3 more through direct protection work. He was retired 4 months ago when his hips started showing dysplasia. Placed at Coronado for his remaining years training new handlers." Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression promising career-ending consequences. "The K-9 facility reported that Odin broke through a reinforced kennel gate 90 minutes ago, something he's never done in 10 years of service. Facility supervisor said he seemed agitated, kept trying to move southeast toward this location. They thought he was disoriented, didn't realize he was tracking a scent he recognized. His handler's scent, from 2 miles away, which shouldn't be possible, but apparently is when the handler raised you from a puppy and deployed with you through hell." Sarah felt Odin press closer against her side, his breathing steady, but his attention never wavering from the men who'd hurt her. She understood what he'd done, the magnitude of what his presence here meant. Dogs didn't break containment for fun. They didn't cross miles of unfamiliar territory on instinct. He'd remembered her, had recognized some combination of scent and sound and pack memory that transcended training. And he'd come for her, the way he'd always come when she needed him in combat. "Senior Chief," Wells said, her JAG officer voice clinical and devastating. "I'm required to inform you that you and every sailor present are under investigation for assault, conspiracy to commit assault, and conduct unbecoming. Military police are securing evidence and documenting the scene. You'll be placed in pre-trial confinement pending court-martial proceedings. Medical personnel are en route for Lieutenant Chen. Brennan finally found his voice, but it came out broken, desperate. We were conducting remedial training. She agreed to participate. There was no assault, just... Just what? Rodriguez interrupted, his fury finally breaking through professional control. Just attacking a superior officer because you decided her credentials weren't real? Just beating a woman who's deployed more times than you have? Just letting your prejudice become brutality because you convinced yourself you were defending standards? Sarah watched emotions cycle across Brennan's face, saw the moment when he understood that everything he'd built his narrative on was fiction. She hadn't been a diversity hire, hadn't been a political checkbox, hadn't been incompetent or unqualified or undeserving. She'd been an operator whose resume exceeded his by an order of magnitude, and he'd assaulted her based on assumptions he'd never questioned. I didn't know, he said quietly, the words inadequate and pathetic. Her record showed intelligence analyst, coordination role, nothing about operational deployment, nothing about... Her real record is classified, Mitchell interrupted. The program she worked in was disbanded last year for budget and political reasons. The 8 operators who went through it were scattered across the fleet with scrubbed service jackets because the operations remained sensitive. She requested assignment here specifically to prove that women could serve in conventional NSW roles without hiding behind classified credentials, to demonstrate that capability matters more than gender. He turned to Sarah, his expression softening fractionally. Sarah, I told you this was a terrible idea. Told you that going dark was unnecessary, that you'd already proven everything worth proving. Sarah met his eyes, felt the weight of promises made and kept. You taught me that changing institutions means refusing to quit when they try to break you. That Hayes died believing women could operate at the highest levels if given the chance. That someone had to prove it was possible. The name Hayes landed like a grenade among the assembled sailors. Sarah watched recognition flash across Mitchell's face, saw old grief surface and subside. Commander Michael Hayes had been the architect of the K-9 integration program, had fought bureaucracy and skepticism and institutional resistance to create something revolutionary. He'd died in a convoy attack outside Kabul in 2022, and Sarah had been there, had held pressure on wounds too catastrophic to survive, while he'd made her promise to keep proving the concept worked. Hayes would be proud, Mitchell said quietly. He'd also be furious that you nearly got killed trying to honor his legacy. Hayes taught me that the mission matters more than comfort. My father taught me that quitting validates every assumption people make about women in combat. Sarah tried to stand, felt her legs buckle, felt Odin brace against her weight to keep her upright. I'm not quitting. I'm showing them what they couldn't see because their fear was louder than evidence. Medical personnel arrived then, corpsmen with equipment and assessment protocols. But Odin growled when they approached. The lead corpsman stopped 3 feet away, his hands raised in surrender. Ma'am, we need to assess your injuries. That dog needs to let us through. Sarah whistled again, a different pattern. Permission granted, friendly forces. Odin relaxed fractionally, moved just enough to allow access while maintaining protective positioning. His eyes never stopped tracking threats, never stopped calculating who might hurt his handler. The corpsman's assessment was quick and professional, his face growing progressively more concerned as he cataloged damage. Multiple fractured ribs, possible internal bleeding, significant contusions consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. Ma'am, you need immediate transport to Naval Medical Center. This isn't field treatable. I'm fine, Sarah said, the words automatic and unconvincing. You're not fine, Rodriguez said, his voice carrying command authority that didn't allow argument. "You're accepting medical care, Lieutenant. That's an order, not a suggestion." Sarah wanted to protest, wanted to maintain the facade of invulnerability that she'd built over 3 weeks of escalating hostility. But her body betrayed her, vision swimming again, legs finally giving out completely. She felt herself falling, felt Odin shift to catch her weight, felt hands that belonged to the corpsman supporting her, while the shepherd watched with focused intensity. "Easy, ma'am," the lead corpsman said, his voice professionally calm while his hands worked to stabilize her. "We've got you. Your dog can come in the ambulance if he'll allow it." Mitchell stepped closer, knelt beside her with joints that protested but complied. "Sarah, listen to me. You proved your point. You endured what these men threw at you and came through the other side. Now you're letting us take care of you. No more testing yourself. No more breaking yourself against their prejudice. You've done enough." She wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could handle more, but the words wouldn't come. Exhaustion and pain and relief at finally being able to stop pretending combined into something overwhelming. Sarah felt tears threaten, forced them back, gave up, and let them fall. "My father said quitting validates assumptions," she whispered. "Said you have to prove you belong through action, not words." "Your father," Mitchell said gently, "would tell you that knowing when to accept help isn't quitting. It's surviving to fight another day. Master Chief Chen was the best SEAL I ever served with, and the smartest thing he taught was that courage isn't refusing assistance. It's knowing your limits and pushing past them until the mission's complete. Your mission here is complete, Sarah. You proved what needed proving. Now let us get you to the hospital." The ambulance doors closed with her and Odin inside, the shepherd lying beside the gurney with his head resting on her hand, his brown eyes watching her face with concern that transcended species. Sarah let herself sink into the painkillers the corpsman administered, felt the edges of consciousness blur, heard Rodriguez's voice through the closing doors promising consequences for everyone involved. Her last thought before darkness took her was of Hayes, dying in her arms outside Kabul, making her promise to prove that his program worked, that women could operate at the highest levels, that capability mattered more than gender. She'd kept that promise, had paid for it in blood and broken bones and 3 weeks of systematic brutality. But she'd kept it. And somewhere in California morning sun, 12 sailors were learning that assumptions cost more than just reputation. They cost everything. The morphine made everything soft except the memories. Sarah drifted between consciousness and something darker for 2 days while surgeons repaired internal bleeding and set ribs that had fractured in 3 places. Odin stayed in her hospital room despite regulations that prohibited animals in patient care areas, and nobody had the courage to tell a 90-pound German shepherd with a combat record to leave. He lay on the floor beside her bed, with his head resting on his paws, brown eyes tracking every nurse and doctor who entered, evaluating threats with the same intensity he'd brought to compound clearances in Helmand Province. The 3rd morning, Sarah woke to find Mitchell sitting in the visitor's chair, his weathered face carrying exhaustion that suggested he'd been there for hours. Odin's tail thumped once against the linoleum in greeting, but he didn't move from his position. "How long have you been here?" Sarah's voice came out rough, damaged from the breathing tube they'd removed yesterday. "Long enough to watch your dog refuse to eat unless the food comes from your hand," Mitchell said. "Hospital staff tried feeding him twice. He just stared at them like they were insulting his intelligence." Sarah reached down carefully, her ribs screaming protest, and rested her hand on Odin's head. The shepherd's tail increased tempo, his entire body relaxing fractionally at her touch. He's stubborn, always has been. He's loyal, there's a difference. Mitchell leaned forward, his expression shifting from concern to something harder. JAG finished their preliminary investigation. All 12 sailors are facing court-martial. Brennan's looking at 3 to 5 years in military prison, dishonorable discharge, loss of all benefits. The others are facing 6 months to 2 years depending on their level of participation. The news should have brought satisfaction, but Sarah felt only hollow exhaustion. Jackson's arm? 70 stitches, some nerve damage. He'll regain full function eventually, but his SEAL career is over regardless. Hard to operate tactically when you've been dishonorably discharged for assaulting a superior officer. Sarah closed her eyes, processed the information through the fog of pain medication. 12 careers destroyed. 12 families impacted. 12 men who'd convinced themselves they were defending standards and instead destroyed everything they claimed to protect. Did they understand? At the end, did any of them understand what they'd actually done? Mitchell's silence answered before his words did. Brennan asked to speak with you. JAG denied the request, but he submitted a written statement. Want to hear it? Not particularly. You should anyway. Mitchell pulled out his phone, found the document, and read with clinical detachment. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Brennan wishes to express remorse for his actions and acknowledges that his judgment was compromised by grief over Lieutenant Reeves's death and misplaced concern about integration standards. He states that had he known Lieutenant Chen's actual qualifications, the incident would never have occurred, and he accepts full responsibility for creating an environment where assault became possible. The words hung in the sterile hospital air, inadequate and infuriating. Sarah felt rage build in her chest, hot and acidic. Had he known my qualifications? That's his takeaway? That the problem was information access, not the fact that he organized the assault of a female officer based on assumptions about her competence? That's what I said. Mitchell pocketed his phone, his expression carrying disgust. The man still doesn't understand that he'd have been wrong even if you were exactly what he thought you were. That testing someone through unauthorized violence isn't protecting standards. It's criminal behavior, regardless of the victim's credentials. Odin growled softly, responding to Sarah's elevated heart rate and the stress hormones her body was releasing. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to control the anger that wanted to consume her. What about the others? Martinez looked uncomfortable near the end. Did he say anything? Martinez submitted his own statement, said he knew it had crossed the line, tried to intervene, was overruled by Brennan. JAG is considering reduced charges in exchange for his testimony, but he's still facing dishonorable discharge minimum. Commands don't keep sailors who participate in assaults, even if they felt bad about it afterwards. The door opened without knocking, and Captain Rodriguez entered with Lieutenant Commander Wells from JAG. Both looked like they'd been awake for days, their uniforms crisp, but their faces carrying exhaustion that came from managing catastrophic institutional failure. Lieutenant Chen, Rodriguez said, his voice formal but not unkind. How are you feeling? Like 12 sailors used me for combatives practice, sir. Fair assessment. Rodriguez pulled up another chair, sat with the careful posture of someone making an official statement. Commander Wells and I need to brief you on investigation findings and discuss your options moving forward. Wells opened a tablet, pulled up documentation that Sarah couldn't read from her hospital bed. The investigation is complete. All 12 sailors have been charged. 6 are cooperating with prosecution in exchange for reduced sentences. The other 6, including Brennan, are fighting the charges. We have video evidence from Admiral Mitchell's phone, medical documentation supporting your injuries, and testimony from K-9 facility staff about Odin's unprecedented behavior in breaking containment to reach you. Video evidence? Sarah hadn't known Mitchell was filming. I started recording when I arrived and saw what was happening. Mitchell interjected. 37 minutes of footage showing systematic assault disguised as training. JAG says it's the most clear-cut case of command climate failure they've seen in a decade. Rodriguez's expression darkened. Which brings us to institutional response. Naval Special Warfare Command is implementing immediate changes. Mandatory bias training for all personnel. Zero-tolerance policy for gender-based harassment with teeth, not just policy statements. Anonymous reporting system that bypasses immediate chain of command. And your experience, with your permission, will be used as a training case study. Sarah felt her stomach turn. You want to make me the poster child for what happens when integration fails? We want to make Brennan and his crew the poster child for what happens when bias becomes brutality, Wells corrected. Your role in the training will be as the operator who survived institutional failure and kept her integrity intact. The hero, not the victim. The distinction mattered, but Sarah wasn't sure she could be anyone's hero right now. She felt hollowed out, broken in ways that surgery couldn't repair. What are my options? You said you needed to discuss options. Rodriguez exchanged glances with Wells, something passing between them that suggested disagreement about approach. Finally, he spoke with careful precision. Medical retirement with full benefits. Immediate approval, no questions asked. Your injuries qualify you for 40 to 60% disability rating, maybe higher if the psychological evaluation supports PTSD diagnosis. Or? Sarah heard the unspoken alternative in his pause. Or you continue serving. Transfer to any command you choose, with my personal recommendation and Admiral Mitchell's endorsement. Or you stay here, return to the integration program once you're medically cleared, and prove that one catastrophic failure doesn't mean the concept is broken. The room fell silent. Sarah looked at each face in turn, reading the politics behind the offer. Medical retirement was the safe choice, the one that let NSW Command say they'd taken care of their wounded, without having to confront the harder question of whether integration could work. Continuing meant being watched, evaluated, turned into a symbol whether she wanted that role or not. What does the command want me to do? She asked quietly. Honestly? Rodriguez leaned forward, his career SEAL facade cracking enough to show something human underneath. Command is terrified. Terrified that this incident becomes a national news story about NSW's toxic culture. Terrified that congressional oversight descends and starts cutting budgets. Terrified that the wrong decision here destroys integration efforts for another generation. So they want whatever you want, because making you happy is the only way to control the narrative. The brutal honesty was refreshing, even as it was depressing. Sarah understood she'd become a political problem with legs, a living reminder of institutional failure that needed careful management. And what do you want me to do, Captain? Rodriguez met her eyes without flinching. I want you to stay. I want you to heal, come back stronger, and prove that capability matters more than gender. I want Brennan and his crew to watch from prison while you succeed in ways they said was impossible. But that's what I want. What you want matters more. Sarah's hand found Odin's head again, fingers tracing the familiar scars and contours. The shepherd pressed into her touch, his breathing steady and calm, his presence an anchor in a conversation spinning toward decisions she wasn't ready to make. I need time to think. You have 2 weeks medical leave, then we'll need a decision, Wells said, her JAG officer voice clinical but not unkind. For what it's worth, Lieutenant, staying would send a powerful message that you can't be broken, that women belong in NSW, regardless of how hard some men fight against it. After they left, Sarah and Mitchell sat in silence, broken only by hospital sounds and Odin's steady breathing. Finally, Sarah spoke the question that had been building since she woke up. Did I make the right choice? Going dark, hiding my credentials, trying to prove something that maybe can't be proven? Mitchell took a long time answering, his weathered face working through emotions that didn't have easy names. Hayes used to say that changing institutions was like moving mountains with a spoon. Impossible, exhausting, and absolutely necessary. You went dark because you believed women shouldn't need classified credentials to be respected in combat roles, that basic competence should be enough. You were right, philosophically, and nearly died, practically. So I was wrong. You were optimistic about how much evidence it takes to change minds that don't want changing. Mitchell stood, walked to the window, looked out at Coronado spreading under California sun. Brennan and his crew had decided you didn't belong before you ever arrived. Your actual capabilities were irrelevant because they'd already written the story. You could have revealed your background on day one, and they'd have found different reasons to reject you. Maybe said you were only qualified because standards were lowered for women in classified programs. Maybe claimed your credentials were fabricated for political reasons. Sarah felt tears threaten, forced them back, failed. Then what was the point? If I can't prove anything, if they'll reject me regardless of evidence, why did I put myself through this? Because 12 sailors are facing court-martial instead of continuing to operate. Because NSW Command is implementing real reforms instead of cosmetic changes. Because the next woman who enters this program won't face the same hell you did. Because your experience proved that tolerating bias has consequences. Mitchell turned from the window, his expression carrying conviction that cut through Sarah's doubt. You didn't change Brennan's mind, but you changed the institution's willingness to protect men like Brennan. That matters. Odin shifted position, rested his chin on Sarah's bed, brown eyes watching her face with concern. She scratched behind his ears, felt him relax, felt some of her own tension drain away. What happens to him after I make my decision about staying or leaving? Odin? Mitchell smiled, the first genuine warmth Sarah had seen from him since the hospital. He's yours. Formal adoption paperwork is already processed. Navy's gifting him to you as a service dog, full VA benefits included. He's earned retirement from military service, 8 years of combat operations, 9 lives saved through detection work, 3 more through protection. He's done his part. Sarah looked at the shepherd who'd crossed 2 miles of base to save her, who'd broken through reinforced containment because he'd recognized her distress, who'd attacked armed sailors without hesitation because pack loyalty transcended orders and regulations and time. He saved me twice now. Once in Syria, once here. 3rd time, actually. Mitchell corrected quietly. You don't remember, but during your 2nd deployment to Afghanistan, you were working a village clearance with a ranger element. Odin alerted on an IED buried in a doorway. You called halt, waited for EOD. Turned out to be a pressure plate wired to 40 pounds of homemade explosive. Would have killed everyone in your element if he'd missed it. The memory surfaced slowly, pulling itself through years of accumulated operations. Sarah remembered the village, remembered Odin's behavior change, remembered the sick feeling when EOD confirmed the device. I'd forgotten. There were so many missions, so many alerts. He never forgot. Dogs don't forget the people who raised them, the people who trusted them, the people who were pack. Mitchell moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. That's why he broke containment. That's why he crossed 2 miles through unfamiliar territory. That's why he attacked armed men who could have killed him. Because you were his handler, his partner, his pack. And pack doesn't abandon pack, even after retirement. After Mitchell left, Sarah lay in the hospital bed with her hand on Odin's head and tried to imagine her future. Medical retirement meant safety, meant healing without pressure, meant never having to prove anything to anyone again. Continuing meant being watched, judged, turned into a symbol of either integration success or failure, depending on how the next few years played out. Her father's voice echoed through memory, words spoken at her high school graduation about standards and capability and refusing to quit. Master Chief Daniel Chen had earned 3 silver stars through actions that remained classified, had commanded respect through competence that nobody could question, had died believing his daughter could serve anywhere she chose if she just refused to quit. But he'd also taught her that surviving wasn't the same as winning, that sometimes the smartest tactical decision was withdrawal and regroup, that knowing when to stop wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. The door opened again, and a woman Sarah didn't recognize entered with visitor credentials clipped to civilian clothes. She was maybe 40, with auburn hair and an athletic build that suggested military background. She stopped when she saw Odin, raised her hands in a non-threatening gesture. "Easy, boy. I'm friendly." Odin's tail wagged once, uncertain. The woman smiled, pulled out her phone, and showed Sarah an image. The photo showed a younger version of the woman in navy fatigues, standing with a Belgian Malinois, both in full tactical gear. The dog wore a vest marked Canine. The woman wore a trident. "Lieutenant Sarah Chen? I'm Commander Patricia Walsh, retired. I went through BUD/S in 2018, one of the first women to complete and get assigned to a SEAL team. I heard about what happened to you through the NSW grapevine." She gestured to the empty chair. "Mind if I sit?" Sarah nodded, her curiosity overriding her exhaustion. Walsh settled into the chair with economical movements, her eyes finding Odin and holding there for a moment before shifting to Sarah. "I'm going to be direct because I think you value that. What happened to you isn't unique. It's predictable. I faced similar resistance when I integrated, though nothing as violent as what Brennan orchestrated. Other women who've come through have faced everything from passive exclusion to active sabotage. The pattern is consistent enough to be institutional, not individual." "That's encouraging," Sarah said, her voice carrying more bitterness than she'd intended. "It's not meant to be encouraging. It's meant to be reality." Walsh leaned forward, her expression intense. "Here's what nobody tells you about being first. It's not about being good enough. It's about being strong enough to survive while the institution figures out how to handle your presence. Some women make it through and stay. Some make it through and leave. Some break and never recover. What happened to you would have broken most people." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "I didn't break." "No, you didn't. You held on until a 90-pound dog had to break through a kennel to save you. That's not weakness. That's surviving against impossible odds." But here's my question. What are you trying to prove now? That you can survive more? That you can endure additional testing until they finally accept you? Or that you've already proven everything that matters? The question cut through Sarah's uncertainty with scalpel precision. Walsh wasn't offering comfort or encouragement. She was offering perspective from someone who'd already walked this path and understood its cost. "I made a promise," Sarah said quietly. "To my father, to Commander Hayes, who built the Canine program, that I'd prove women could serve at the highest levels without special accommodations, that capability mattered more than gender." And you did prove it. You survived BUD/S, deployed 6 times, earned a Navy Cross, trained and deployed with a war dog through multiple theaters. Then you came here, hid all that, and proved you could meet standards even when 12 men were actively trying to break you. Walsh's voice gentled slightly. The question isn't whether you proved your point. It's whether continuing to prove it over and over is worth the cost. Sarah didn't have an answer. Walsh stood, moved toward the door, then paused the same way Mitchell had. Whatever you decide, you've already changed things. Brennan and his crew are facing real consequences instead of being protected by institutional silence. NSW Command is implementing actual reforms. The next woman who comes through won't face what you faced because your experience proved that tolerance for bias has limits. She met Sarah's eyes with understanding that transcended words. You can stop now. You've earned that right. Or you can keep fighting. Either choice is valid. But make the choice for yourself, not for ghosts. After Walsh left, Sarah lay in the silence and felt the weight of decisions pressing down like gravity. Odin shifted, his head moving from her bed to her lap, his warm weight a comfort that transcended species. She thought about her father, about Hayes, about promises made to dead men who couldn't release her from obligations they'd never intended to become chains. She thought about Brennan in a cell somewhere, still convinced he'd been right, still unable to see that bias had destroyed his career more effectively than any enemy ever could. She thought about the 11 other sailors facing courts-martial, families destroyed, futures obliterated, all because they'd convinced themselves that testing a woman was the same as maintaining standards. And she thought about the next woman, the next test case, the next person who'd walk through integration programs and face resistance and judgment and systematic efforts to make them quit. Would that woman face the same hell Sarah had endured? Or would reforms actually mean something? Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message, the sound cutting through her spiral of thoughts. The message was from Captain Rodriguez, brief and direct. Take your time deciding, but know this. Staying would matter, not just for you, for everyone who comes after. She set the phone down, closed her eyes, and let herself drift toward sleep with Odin's weight warm against her leg. The decision could wait. The healing couldn't. But somewhere in the space between sleep and waking, Sarah understood what her choice would be. Not because of promises to dead men, or institutional pressure, or the weight of being first. Because refusing to quit wasn't just her father's lesson. It was who she'd become. The court-martial proceedings began on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the assault, and Sarah attended despite medical advice suggesting she wait another month. Her ribs still ached when she breathed too deeply, and standing for more than 20 minutes required conscious effort to hide the pain. But she walked into that courtroom at Naval Base San Diego with Odin at her side, and her dress whites pressed to knife edges, because some battles couldn't be won by staying home. Brennan looked smaller in civilian clothes, without the authority of rank wrapped around him. He sat at the defense table between his attorney and his consequences, his face carrying the kind of hollow exhaustion that came from watching your entire life collapse in slow motion. When Sarah entered, his eyes found hers, held for 3 seconds, then dropped to the floor with something that might have been shame, but looked more like resentment. The prosecution's case took 4 days to present, each witness adding layers to a narrative of systematic harassment that culminated in assault. Martinez testified first, his voice quiet but clear as he described 3 weeks of escalating hostility that he'd witnessed but failed to stop. His hands shook when the prosecutor showed video footage from Mitchell's phone, 23 minutes of Sarah being beaten, while 12 men either participated or watched. "Did you attempt to intervene?" the prosecutor asked, her voice clinical. "I told Senior Chief Brennan that we should stop, that it had gone too far." "And what was his response?" Martinez's voice dropped to barely audible. He said the lieutenant needed to prove she could handle the same training we all went through. That if she couldn't handle pressure, she didn't belong in NSW. Did you believe that justification? The pause stretched long enough that the judge prompted Martinez to answer. Finally, he spoke with words that sounded like they were being extracted with pliers. No, ma'am. I knew it was assault. I knew it was wrong. I didn't stop it because I was afraid of being excluded from the team. The prosecutor let that admission hang in the courtroom air, let everyone absorb the reality that fear of social rejection had been stronger than moral obligation. Did Lieutenant Chen ever ask for this training evolution? No, ma'am. She was told it was mandatory, that command had authorized it. We all knew that was a lie. Sarah watched Martinez's career end in real time, watched him trade testimony for reduced charges while destroying whatever remained of his integrity. Part of her felt satisfaction at the accountability. Another part, smaller but more honest, felt grief for the waste of it all. Martinez wasn't evil. He was weak, and weakness had cost him everything. The second day brought medical testimony that made the assault impossible to minimize. The surgeon who'd operated on Sarah walked the court through internal injuries with clinical precision, describing torn blood vessels and fractured ribs, and damage consistent with sustained beating, rather than training accidents. He pulled up X-rays that showed the specific pattern of fractures, explained how the injuries indicated multiple targeted strikes to the same locations. In your professional opinion, doctor, were these injuries consistent with combatives training? No. These injuries are consistent with assault. The pattern of damage suggests deliberate targeting of vulnerable areas by someone with knowledge of human anatomy. The rib fractures alone required surgical intervention to prevent the bone fragments from puncturing her lung. Sarah felt the courtroom's attention shift to her, felt the weight of judgment and pity and discomfort. She kept her expression neutral, her posture straight, her hand resting on Odin's head, while the shepherd tracked every person in the room with focused attention. She wouldn't give them weakness, wouldn't give them the victim narrative they were building around her existence. The defense's strategy became clear during cross-examination. They weren't denying the assault happened. They were arguing that Brennan had believed it was legitimate training, that his judgment had been compromised by grief over Lieutenant Reeves's death, that Sarah's classified background meant he couldn't have known she was qualified. The defense attorney hammered this point repeatedly, suggesting that institutional failure to properly credential Sarah had contributed to Brennan's mistakes. Senior Chief Brennan believed he was testing standards, not targeting an individual, the attorney argued during his opening statement. His actions, while misguided, were motivated by genuine concern for unit readiness and combat effectiveness. He was operating with incomplete information about Lieutenant Chen's actual qualifications. Sarah felt rage build in her chest, hot and acidic. The defense was essentially arguing that assaulting her would have been wrong if they'd known she was qualified, but was understandable given her service record appeared insufficient. That the crime wasn't the violence, it was the mistaken belief about her credentials. Mitchell leaned close during a break, his voice low enough that only Sarah could hear. They're going to lose. Every member of that panel knows that qualification status doesn't justify assault, but they're building an appeal strategy, claiming diminished capacity due to incomplete information. Will it work? Not for the conviction. Maybe for reducing the sentence. Mitchell's expression hardened. Military justice isn't always about what's right. Sometimes it's about what's defensible in appellate review. The third day brought Commander Hayes's name into testimony, and Sarah felt her grief resurface like a rip current. The prosecution called Admiral Mitchell to establish Sarah's actual credentials, and he walked the court through the classified K-9 program with careful attention to what could be disclosed in an open proceeding. Commander Hayes developed this program because he believed handler operators could revolutionize special operations, Mitchell explained, his voice carrying weight that transcended rank. Lieutenant Chen was selected for the initial cadre based on her exceptional performance in canine coordination roles and her demonstrated tactical aptitude. She completed modified BUD/S, advanced tactical training, and deployed 6 times in support of classified operations. The defense attorney stood for cross-examination, his strategy transparent. Admiral Mitchell, if Lieutenant Chen's credentials were so impressive, why were they classified? Why wasn't her service record accessible to the commands where she was assigned? The operations she participated in remained sensitive. Her service record was scrubbed to protect ongoing intelligence equities. So Senior Chief Brennan had no way of knowing her actual qualifications? Mitchell's expression went cold in ways that made experienced military personnel sit straighter. Senior Chief Brennan had no right to organize an unauthorized assault, regardless of Lieutenant Chen's qualifications. Standards are tested through official evaluations, not vigilante violence. His ignorance of her background doesn't excuse his criminal behavior. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations that the judge had to gavel into silence. The defense attorney tried to recover, suggesting that Brennan's actions were within the bounds of training evolutions conducted throughout NSW. Mitch descendants destroyed that argument with 3 words: not without authorization. On the 4th day, the prosecution called Sarah to testify, and she walked to the witness stand with Odin remaining at her seat, his eyes tracking her movement with concern. The prosecutor started gently, establishing timeline and context, building toward the assault through preliminary questions about her arrival at Coronado and the reception she'd received. Lieutenant Chen, when you arrived at Naval Special Warfare Command, did you anticipate resistance to your presence? Yes, ma'am. I'd been briefed on cultural challenges regarding women in NSW roles. I expected professional skepticism and prepared to prove my competence through performance. Did you expect to be assaulted by 12 members of your own command? Sarah took a breath, felt her ribs protest, pushed through the pain. No, ma'am. I expected testing. I expected to have my work scrutinized more closely than male peers. I didn't expect to be beaten in an unauthorized evolution designed to break me. The prosecutor walked her through 3 weeks of escalating harassment, each incident documented and corroborated by other witnesses. Sarah kept her voice level, professional, giving them facts without emotion. She described equipment sabotage, social isolation, the land navigation exercise where Davis had challenged her competence. She described the fake message that had lured her to the abandoned training facility, the combat load that exceeded standard weight, the obstacle course that had been modified with rocks in the tunnel. Then came the assault itself, and Sarah felt the courtroom's attention sharpen. She described boots and fists, and Brennan's voice asking who would save her. Described the moment when Odin had appeared from nowhere, crossing 2 miles of base because he'd recognized her distress. Described the shepherd attacking armed sailors to protect her, and the whistle commands that had proven her connection to a dog the defense was claiming she'd never worked with. Why didn't you reveal your actual credentials earlier? The prosecutor asked. You could have shut down the harassment immediately by disclosing your classified background. Sarah had prepared for this question, had worked with JAG to craft an answer that balanced truth with tactical necessity. I came to Coronado to prove that women could serve in NSW support roles without hiding behind classified credentials. That basic competence should be sufficient for acceptance. I believed that revealing my operational background would undermine that demonstration, would allow critics to say, I only succeeded because of special training, rather than fundamental capability. Did you believe you could endure the harassment without intervention? Yes, ma'am. I'd survived worse in combat. I thought I could survive this. Were you wrong? Sarah's voice caught, the first crack in her professional facade. Yes, ma'am. I underestimated how far bias could escalate when unchecked. I thought military discipline and chain of command would prevent physical violence. I was wrong. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal, exactly as Sarah had expected. He hammered on her decision to hide credentials, suggesting she'd created the conditions for misunderstanding. He implied that her refusal to report harassment through proper channels had enabled escalation. He questioned whether her injuries were as severe as medical testimony suggested, pointing out that she was standing in court just 6 weeks later. Lieutenant Chen, isn't it true that you could have stopped all of this by simply disclosing your background to Senior Chief Brennan? Isn't it true that Senior Chief Brennan could have stopped all of this by not organizing an assault? Sarah's response came faster than her JAG preparation had suggested, emotion breaking through professional control. My credentials are irrelevant. You don't get to beat someone because you think they're unqualified. That's not how military standards work. The defense attorney pressed harder. But you admit you deliberately concealed information that would have changed Senior Chief Brennan's assessment of your capabilities? I concealed classified information I wasn't authorized to disclose. Senior Chief Brennan organized an unauthorized assault based on assumptions he never questioned. Those aren't equivalent failures. The judge intervened before the attorney could respond, reminding him that the witness's credentials weren't on trial. But the damage was done. The seed planted that Sarah bore some responsibility for what had happened to her. During the lunch break, Sarah found Commander Walsh waiting outside the courtroom. The retired SEAL operator who'd visited Sarah in the hospital carried coffee and an expression that suggested she'd watched the cross-examination with recognition. That was skillful, Walsh said, handing Sarah the coffee. He tried to make you responsible for their decision to assault you. You didn't let him. Felt like I let him, Sarah admitted, her voice tired. Felt like every answer I gave proved his point that I should have just disclosed my background and avoided the whole situation. That's what he wanted you to feel. That's the defense strategy in assault cases. Make the victim responsible for their own victimization. Walsh's voice hardened. Don't let it work. You made tactical decisions based on the mission you set for yourself. Those decisions didn't cause the assault. Brennan's choices caused the assault. His bias, his rage, his inability to see past his prejudices. That's on him, not you. Sarah wanted to believe that, but the defense attorney's words echoed through her exhaustion. She'd hidden information that would have changed everything. She'd chosen pride over safety. She'd convinced herself she could endure anything, and instead had nearly died proving a point that maybe didn't need proving. Did you ever regret it? Sarah asked quietly. Going through BUD/S? Integrating into the teams? Being first? Walsh took a long time answering, her eyes focused on something distant. Every day for the first 2 years. The harassment, the testing, the constant scrutiny. I thought about quitting more times than I can count. But here's what I eventually understood. My regret wasn't about the choice to serve. It was about the cost of changing institutions that don't want to change. And that cost isn't our fault. It's the institution's failure, not ours. The afternoon session brought closing arguments, and both attorneys presented competing narratives about accountability and intention. The prosecution argued that Brennan had organized premeditated assault motivated by gender bias and rage over Lieutenant Reeves's death. The defense argued that Brennan had exercised poor judgment while attempting to maintain standards, that his actions were misguided rather than criminal. The panel deliberated for 7 hours, and Sarah spent that time in a conference room with Mitchell and Odin, trying not to imagine what verdict would emerge. Part of her wanted convictions on every charge, wanted Brennan and his crew to face maximum consequences. Another part, smaller but more complicated, wondered what good prison time would accomplish beyond revenge. What happens if they find him not guilty? Sarah asked during hour 5. Mitchell didn't sugarcoat his answer. then NSW Command faces a crisis. Because if assault can be justified as standards enforcement, then integration is impossible. Women will never be safe in environments where violence is considered acceptable testing methodology. And if they find him guilty? Then we've established that bias has limits, that testing doesn't justify assault, that women's presence in NSW is protected by military justice, not just policy statements. Mitchell leaned back, his weathered face showing exhaustion. Either way, your testimony changed the calculus. You forced them to confront what actually happened, instead of accepting comfortable narratives about training accidents. The panel returned with verdicts at 1847, their expressions grave. The judge read the findings with clinical precision that stripped emotion from career-ending consequences. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Brennan, guilty on all charges, including assault, conspiracy, and conduct unbecoming. Sentence: 4 years confinement, reduction to E1, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and benefits. The other 11 sailors received sentences ranging from 6 months to 3 years depending on their level of participation, all facing dishonorable discharge and loss of benefits. Jackson, whose arm Odin had damaged, received 2 years. Martinez, who'd testified for the prosecution, received 6 months and bad conduct discharge instead of dishonorable. Brennan's face remained expressionless as the judge pronounced sentence, but Sarah saw his hands shaking where they rested on the defense table. She felt no satisfaction, no vindication, just hollow exhaustion and the weight of 12 careers destroyed. The outcome was just, but justice felt less like victory and more like everyone losing. After the court adjourned, Sarah stood outside watching the sun set over San Diego, Odin pressed against her leg, both of them processing what the verdicts meant. Mitch joined her after several minutes, his presence comfortable in its silence. "Captain Rodriguez wants to meet tomorrow," he said finally. "Says you need to make your decision about staying or taking medical retirement. The convictions change the political landscape. Command can support whatever you choose now without appearing to protect themselves." Sarah had been avoiding that decision for 6 weeks, letting recovery and court proceedings delay the inevitable choice. Stay and continue proving something that apparently needed endless proof. Leave and accept that maybe changing institutions was someone else's battle. Both options felt like losing in different ways. "What did my father do?" she asked quietly, "when he faced decisions that didn't have good answers?" Mitchell smiled, the expression carrying memory and grief. "Master Chief Chen used to say that the only failure was quitting before the mission was complete, but he also taught that missions change, that tactical flexibility means recognizing when your original objective is no longer achievable and adapting. He was smart enough to know the difference between persistence and stubbornness." "I'm not sure I'm that smart." "You're smarter than you think. Smart enough to survive what would have broken most people. Smart enough to testify without losing your integrity. Smart enough to keep the mission in mind, even when it cost you everything." Mitchell turned to face her directly. "The question isn't whether you're smart enough. It's whether you still believe the mission is worth the cost." Sarah looked at Odin, at the scars he carried from operations she couldn't discuss, at the way his brown eyes tracked her face with concern that transcended species. He'd given 8 years to missions that wouldn't be declassified for decades, had saved lives through work that would never be publicly acknowledged, had earned retirement through service that mattered, regardless of recognition. Maybe she'd already done the same. Maybe 6 deployments and a Navy Cross, and surviving Brennan's assault was enough proof for one lifetime. Or maybe the next woman who walked through these gates needed to know that someone had stayed, had refused to quit, had proven that bias couldn't win if you just refused to break. Sarah made her decision in that sunset moment, standing outside a courthouse where 12 men had faced consequences for believing women were targets instead of teammates. She didn't make it for ghosts or promises or institutional pressure. She made it for herself. Because refusing to quit wasn't just her father's lesson anymore. It was who she'd become through every operation, every deployment, every moment when stopping meant failing, and failing meant letting down the people who depended on her. "Tell Captain Rodriguez I'll meet him tomorrow," Sarah said quietly. "And tell him I already know my answer." Captain Rodriguez's office felt different on Wednesday morning. The same furniture and walls somehow transformed by what had happened in the 6 weeks since Sarah had last stood here. She entered with Odin at her side, her dress whites bearing the Navy cross ribbon that Mitchell had insisted she start wearing. And Rodriguez stood when she entered, a gesture of respect he hadn't offered during her initial assignment. "Lieutenant Chen, please sit." He gestured to the chair, waited for her to settle before continuing. "I'm required to start by asking about your physical status. Are you cleared for full duty?" "Medical says 8 more weeks for complete rib healing, but I'm cleared for administrative duties and light physical training." Sarah kept her voice professional, giving him facts without the vulnerability that wanted to leak through. "The psychological evaluation cleared me for continued service without restrictions." Rodriguez nodded slowly, his expression carrying something that looked like relief mixed with continued concern. "The court-martial verdicts change our tactical landscape. All 12 sailors convicted, Brennan facing 4 years confinement, institutional accountability established. Command can support whatever decision you make without political complications." "You're saying I can leave without it looking like you're pushing me out?" "I'm saying you've earned the right to choose your path forward without institutional pressure." Rodriguez leaned back, his career SEAL facade cracking enough to show something human. "What's your decision, Lieutenant?" Sarah had rehearsed this conversation in her head for 6 weeks, had prepared arguments and justifications and explanations for either choice. But sitting in Rodriguez's office with Odin's warm weight against her leg and the Navy Cross ribbon on her chest, the rehearsed words felt inadequate for what she needed to say. "I'm staying, but not in the role I originally filled. I want to work integration advisory, helping female candidates navigate the system and ensuring commands maintain accountability for harassment and discrimination." Rodriguez's eyebrows rose fractionally, surprise breaking through his professional control. "That's a significant shift from your original assignment. What changed?" "I learned that proving myself repeatedly to people who don't want to be convinced is exhausting and maybe unnecessary. But ensuring the next woman doesn't face what I faced, that's a mission worth completing." Sarah met his eyes without flinching. "Commander Hayes taught me that changing institutions means breaking them against reality until they adapt. I broke them. Now I want to help with the adaptation." The silence stretched while Rodriguez processed her words, his expression cycling through emotions Sarah couldn't fully read. Finally, he nodded once, decisive. "Approved. You'll be assigned to NSW Command Integration Office, working directly with me and Commander Wells from JAG. Your role will be advisory initially, but we're building authority for intervention when harassment occurs. You'll have the power to stop what happened to you from happening to others." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, pressure releasing that she hadn't realized was building. This wasn't the victory she'd imagined when she'd arrived 6 weeks ago, but it was something more valuable. Authority to protect instead of just endure. Permission to change systems instead of just surviving them. "When do I start?" 2 weeks. Use the time to finish healing, prepare for the role, and maybe take Odin somewhere he can just be a dog instead of a service animal. Rodriguez stood, extended his hand across the desk. "Welcome back, Lieutenant. The Navy's lucky to have you." The first female candidate Sarah advised arrived 3 weeks later, a 24-year-old lieutenant named Jessica Ramirez, who'd completed BUD/S and was integrating into a SEAL support team. Ramirez walked into Sarah's office, carrying tension in her shoulders and doubt in her eyes, the familiar combination of determination and fear that Sarah recognized from her own mirror 6 months ago. "Lieutenant Chen, I'm Jessica Ramirez. Command said you could help me navigate integration." Sarah gestured to a chair, noted how Ramirez's eyes tracked Odin with the kind of tactical assessment that spoke of someone who understood working dogs. "Tell me about your team."
"What's the reception been like?"
Ramirez's professional facade cracked immediately, exhaustion and frustration pouring through. "Half the team treats me like I'm invisible. The other half watches everything I do like they're waiting for me to fail. My team leader makes comments about diversity requirements every time he assigns me tasks. Nothing I can report officially, just constant reminders that I'm not wanted." Sarah had heard similar stories from 3 other female candidates in the past 2 weeks, the pattern consistent enough to be institutional. Has anyone crossed from passive resistance to active harassment? Define active. My equipment keeps going missing. My evaluations are more detailed than anyone else's. During a training evolution last week, someone accidentally knocked me into the water during a boat drill. Ramirez's voice carried anger and helplessness in equal measure. "I can handle the physical stuff. It's the constant message that I don't belong that's wearing me down." Sarah recognized that exhaustion intimately, remembered the weight of operating in an environment where every action was scrutinized, and every mistake was proof that women couldn't handle the job. "Here's what we're going to do. First, you're going to document everything. Times, dates, witnesses, specific incidents. Second, I'm going to observe your team's next training evolution. Third, if I see what you're describing, I'm going to intervene immediately. Not through you, through your chain of command." Ramirez's expression shifted from resignation to something closer to hope. "You can do that? Just intervene?" "That's my job now, ensuring integration happens professionally instead of hostilely." Sarah leaned forward, her voice carrying conviction that came from experience rather than optimism. "You shouldn't have to endure harassment to prove you belong. That's not testing, that's hazing. And we've established through court-martial that hazing has consequences." The training evolution Sarah observed 2 days later confirmed everything Ramirez had described. The team leader, a senior chief named Dawson, assigned Ramirez to every difficult task while providing minimal guidance, criticized her performance with language he didn't use for male team members, and allowed other sailors to crowd her space during boat drills in ways that forced her into disadvantageous positions. Sarah watched for 45 minutes, documenting each incident with clinical precision, then called for a halt. Dawson looked at her with confusion that shifted to irritation when she identified herself and her role. "We're in the middle of a training evolution, Lieutenant. What's this about?" "It's about the fact that you've assigned Lieutenant Ramirez to 8 consecutive difficult tasks while rotating male team members through easier assignments. It's about language that creates hostile work environment. It's about training practices that violate updated NSW command integration protocols." Sarah kept her voice professional, giving him facts instead of accusations. "You're going to take a 15-minute break while I brief you on current standards. Your team will resume training after you understand your obligations." Dawson's face flushed red, his hands clenching at his sides. "Are you seriously interrupting my training to lecture me about integration policy?" "I'm seriously preventing you from creating the conditions that led to Senior Chief Brennan's court-martial and 4-year prison sentence." "You're familiar with that case?" The mention of Brennan's name changed Dawson's expression from irritation to calculation. Everyone in NSW had heard about the court-martial, The verdict had sent shockwaves through commands that previously believed harassment was untouchable. I'm familiar. Then you understand that creating hostile environments for female personnel has consequences, that testing through harassment is assault, not training, that your obligation is to evaluate Ramirez on performance, not to make her job harder because her presence makes you uncomfortable. Sarah held his gaze, refusing to let him dismiss her authority. I'm not here to make your job difficult. I'm here to ensure integration happens professionally. Work with me, or explain to Captain Rodriguez why you're choosing not to. The training evolution resumed with notably different tone, Dawson moderating his language and ensuring Ramirez received the same guidance as male team members. It wasn't perfect. The underlying resistance remained, but the overt harassment stopped. Sarah filed her report with Rodriguez, noting improvement but recommending continued monitoring. You made Dawson uncomfortable, Rodriguez said during their weekly meeting, his tone suggesting this was observation rather than criticism. Dawson made Ramirez's job impossible through systematic exclusion. I made his choice clear: adapt or face consequences. That's what systemic change looks like. Rodriguez smiled, the expression carrying approval. Commander Wells is impressed with your approach. Direct intervention before harassment escalates instead of waiting for complaints after damage is done. She wants to expand the integration advisory role, bring in 2 more officers to cover additional commands. The integration office grew over the following months, Sarah training 2 additional advisors on intervention protocols and documentation standards. They developed systems for early identification of problematic patterns, direct engagement with command leadership, and escalation procedures when resistance continued despite intervention. The work was exhausting, each case bringing its own complications, but Sarah watched female candidates succeed who would have quit or been driven out under the old system. The moment that crystallized everything came 4 months after Sarah's return, during an obstacle course evolution she was observing for a new integration candidate. The female lieutenant was struggling with a rope climb, her arms shaking from exhaustion, male team members below her offering advice and encouragement rather than mockery. One sailor noticed her grip failing and moved to spot her descent, ensuring she could recover safely instead of falling. Sarah felt tears threaten, recognition flooding through her that this was what change looked like. Not perfect acceptance, but willing hands reaching down instead of pushing down. Standards maintained, while dignity remained intact. The future her father had believed possible. A voice behind her made Sarah turn, and she found herself facing a familiar face that shouldn't have been on base. Martinez, the petty officer who testified against Brennan, stood in civilian clothes with an expression carrying shame and determination in equal measure. Lieutenant Chen, I'm not sure you remember me. I remember you, Petty Officer Martinez. You were discharged 6 months ago. Sarah kept her voice neutral, unsure what this unexpected meeting meant. I was. Bad conduct discharge. 6 months confinement for my role in what happened to you. Martinez's hands shook slightly as he spoke, nervous energy looking for release. I'm not here to make excuses or ask for forgiveness. I'm here because I've been working with a veterans advocacy group that addresses toxic culture in military environments. They asked me to speak to active duty personnel about my experience, about how easy it is to let bias become brutality when nobody intervenes. Sarah studied his face, reading sincerity that seemed genuine, but might have been performance. What do you tell them? That I watched you get beaten and did nothing beyond weak objections. That I prioritized social acceptance over moral obligation. That I destroyed my career and hurt someone who deserved better because I was afraid of being excluded. Martinez's voice caught, emotion breaking through prepared words. That if I could go back, I'd have stopped Brennan the first time he crossed the line, instead of waiting until you were hospitalized. The honesty was uncomfortable, forcing Sarah to confront the reality that redemption was messy and complicated. Martinez had participated in her assault, had enabled Brennan's escalation through his silence, had earned his discharge through his choices. But he was also trying to ensure his mistakes became lessons instead of just failures. Does it help? Talking to active duty personnel about what happened? Some listen.
Some dismiss me as weak or politically correct. But a few, maybe 1 in 10, they hear what I'm really saying. That bias unchallenged becomes violence. That careers and lives get destroyed when good people stay silent. If I reach one person who might otherwise become the next Brennan, maybe I've paid forward some tiny fraction of the damage I caused. Martinez met her eyes, his expression carrying vulnerability that hadn't been there during the court-martial. I can't fix what I did to you, but maybe I can prevent it happening to someone else. Sarah wanted to feel anger, wanted to reject his attempted redemption as inadequate compensation for his role in her assault. But standing there, watching female candidates succeed where she'd nearly failed, she understood that change required imperfect allies. Martinez's redemption tour wouldn't erase his participation, but it might prevent the next assault. And prevention mattered more than revenge. Keep talking to people, she said quietly. Keep telling the truth about what happens when bias becomes brutality. And if you're serious about preventing future incidents, contact Commander Wells at JAG. She's developing training curricula that could use testimony from someone who participated in harassment and understands its progression.
Martinez's face showed surprise and something that looked like gratitude.
You'd recommend me after what I did?
I'd recommend you despite what you did, because what you're doing now matters more than what you did then. Sarah turned back to the training evolution, watched the female lieutenant complete her rope climb with assistance from teammates who'd chosen support over sabotage. That's what institutional change looks like. Not perfect people making perfect choices, but flawed people learning from failures and choosing better.
6 months after returning to duty, Sarah drove to Arlington National Cemetery with Odin riding passenger seat, his head out the window and his ears tracking California wind like he was still a working dog instead of a retired service animal. The drive took 6 hours, and Sarah used the time to process everything that had happened since Brennan's assault. The way trauma and recovery and institutional change had reshaped her understanding of what service meant. Her father's grave sat in Section 60, among other global war on terror casualties, a white marble headstone bearing his name and rank and the dates that bracketed his service. Master Chief Daniel Chen, 3 silver stars, and a legacy that had defined Sarah's choices more than any living influence. She knelt in the grass with Odin beside her, pressed her hand against marble that was cool despite afternoon sun, and spoke words that had been building for months. I kept my promise. Proved that women can serve at the highest levels without special accommodations.
Proved that capability matters more than gender. But I learned something you didn't teach me, or maybe something I wasn't ready to understand. Sarah felt tears threaten. Let them fall without shame. Proving myself repeatedly to people who don't want to be convinced isn't strength. It's accepting abuse disguised as testing. You taught me not to quit, but you didn't teach me that knowing when to stop proving and start changing is wisdom, not weakness. The cemetery remained silent except for wind through grass and Odin's steady breathing. Sarah had imagined this conversation bringing closure, some sense of resolution that would make the past 6 months feel meaningful. Instead, she felt the complicated grief of loving someone whose lessons required updating, whose legacy demanded honoring while recognizing its limitations. I'm not trying to be you anymore. Not trying to earn respect through endurance.
I'm trying to build a system where the next woman doesn't have to endure what I did, where proving yourself once is sufficient instead of requiring endless repetition. Sarah stood, her knees protesting, Odin rising with her and pressing against her leg. Hayes would understand. He always said changing institutions meant breaking them against reality. I broke them. Now I'm helping rebuild something better. The drive back to Coronado felt lighter, some burden Sarah had been carrying released into Arlington soil. She returned to base at dusk, parked outside the integration office, and sat for a moment watching sailors move through evening routines. Female personnel walked among male counterparts without the isolation Sarah had experienced. Not fully integrated, but no longer completely excluded. The change was incremental, insufficient, but present in ways that hadn't existed 6 months ago. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Commander Walsh, the retired SEAL who'd visited her in the hospital. The message was brief. Heard about your work with Integration Advisory. You're changing minds. Keep going. The final validation came during a command briefing 2 weeks later, when a senior chief Sarah had never met approached her after the meeting. He was 40-something, with 2 decades of service written in his weathered features, and the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was. Lieutenant Chen, Senior Chief Peterson, Special Boat Team 12. Got a minute? Sarah nodded, curious about what this unexpected conversation would bring. Peterson glanced around, ensuring their discussion remained private, then spoke with careful precision. I served with your father, deployed with him to Iraq in 2008. Best team leader I ever worked with. He talked about you constantly. Said you were going to serve someday and change everything about what people thought women could do. Peterson's voice softened. I'm ashamed to say I didn't believe him. Thought he was just a proud father making predictions that wouldn't survive reality. I was wrong. Sarah felt her throat tighten, words from someone who'd known her father carrying weight that transcended rank. What changed your mind? Watching what you've built with Integration Advisory. Watching female candidates succeed because you're ensuring commands maintain standards without creating hostile environments. Watching sailors like Dawson adapt their behavior because someone finally held them accountable. Peterson met her eyes with respect that felt earned rather than obligatory. Your father said you'd prove that capability matters more than gender. You did that. But you did something more important too. You proved that institutions can change if someone refuses to quit pushing them. The words landed like vindication, not because Peterson's approval mattered specifically, but because he represented the skeptics her father had faced. The doubters who'd needed proof before accepting that women belonged in combat roles. Sarah had spent 6 months providing that proof through survival and advocacy and systematic intervention in harassment cases. Thank you for telling me that, Senior Chief. It means more than you probably realize. Peterson nodded once, turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. There's a photo in the SEAL Team 5 ready room. Your father with his element before a mission in Fallujah. He's wearing a bracelet his daughter made him. Some kind of paracord thing with her initials. Refused to take it off, even though it violated uniform standards. Said it reminded him what he was fighting for. Sarah remembered making that bracelet at age 15, her teenage confidence that crude knots and good intentions could protect her father in combat. She'd thought it had been lost with his personal effects after his death, hadn't realized he'd worn it to war, like armor that actually meant something. I didn't know he kept it. Kept it and wore it every single mission. Your father believed in you before you believed in yourself. I'm glad you proved him right. Peterson walked away, leaving Sarah standing in the hallway with Odin and the weight of legacies that demanded honoring through action rather than just memory. That evening, Sarah returned to her quarters and found a package waiting. Admiral Mitchell's name on the return address. Inside was a photo she'd never seen before. Her father, in full combat gear, standing with his SEAL element in Fallujah,
the paracord bracelet visible on his wrist. A note accompanied the photo in Mitchell's precise handwriting. Found this in archives while documenting the K9 program history. Thought you should have it. Your father would be proud of what you've built. Hayes would be too. They both believed institutions could change. You proved they were right. Sarah placed the photo on her desk beside the image of her graduation from the classified K9 program. Two pieces of history that bracketed who she'd been and who she'd become. Odin settled at her feet with the contentment of a dog who'd found his pack again, and Sarah sat in the quiet of her quarters processing 6 months that had contained lifetimes of pain and growth and hard-won understanding. She'd come to Coronado believing she needed to prove women belonged through endurance, through surviving tests that men designed to break her. She'd learned instead that proving yourself to people who'd already decided you didn't belong was impossible and unnecessary. That real change came through accountability, intervention, and systematic refusal to tolerate bias that destroyed careers and lives. 12 sailors had learned that bias had consequences. Dozens of female candidates had succeeded because Sarah ensured they faced evaluation rather than harassment. Hundreds of male sailors had been trained on new standards that made integration possible rather than theoretical. The work wasn't finished, would never be completely finished, but the direction was clear. Sarah Chen had kept her promise to Commander Hayes, had honored her father's belief that women could serve anywhere, had proven that capability mattered more than gender. But more importantly, she'd learned that changing institutions required more than surviving their hostility. It required refusing to quit until the hostility itself was eliminated, until the next woman could serve without needing a 90-pound German shepherd to save her from her own teammates. She'd survived the test Brennan designed to break her. Now she was ensuring no one else faced the same test. That was victory. That was service. That was what refusing to quit actually meant, when the mission was bigger than personal endurance, and the stakes were measured in futures protected, rather than just battles survived. And somewhere in a California evening, Odin's tail thumped against the floor with contentment that transcended words. A retired war dog who'd saved his handler twice and understood that pack meant protecting each other until the mission was complete. Their mission wasn't finished, but it was finally pointed toward something worth completing. Standards maintained, dignity intact, change real instead of theoretical. Because refusing to quit meant changing the fight itself, not just surviving its brutality. That's what her father had really meant. That's what Hayes had died believing. And that's exactly what Sarah Chen had proven through blood and broken bones and the kind of courage that rebuilt broken systems instead of just enduring them.